Carrying 488,000 riders each day, the Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority, MARTA for short, is the public transport authority for the rapidly sprawling city of Atlanta. But automobile traffic is still an enormous problem, one joked and bemoaned at every work-related gathering, as people complain about spending so much time in their cars. But why? Why doesn't Atlanta have a successful public transportation system? And why doesn't it extend into the suburbs, where many of Metro Atlanta's residents live? And why is it so expensive? To answer that question, we have to go back to 1971.
Whoosh!
Actually, let's go back a few more years to get the whole picture. Metro Atlanta consists of the city and 5 surrounding counties: Gwinnett, Fulton, Cobb, Clayton, and DeKalb, where I'm from. All the counties except Cobb approved the public transit plan in 1965, and in 1966, a constitutional amendment that allowed state funds for 10% of the operating costs was passed, but the state never actually provided any funds. In 1968, voters rejected measures to fund MARTA using property taxes, and in 1971, Clayton and Gwinnett dropped out of the agreement completely. So ultimately, it was decided that MARTA would be subsidized by a sales tax in the city, Fulton, and DeKalb. Georgia Assembly legislators were largely opposed to Atlanta, but the measure passed anyways because they could not argue with a sales tax in the affected areas only. The biggest obstacle, however, was orchestrated by segregationist Lester Maddox, a former Georgia governor, who insisted that only 50% of sales tax revenue could go to funding MARTA. As such, anytime MARTA has had to make changes, it has to either cut costs or raise fares, leaving the price at $2.50 for a one-way trip, which is extraordinarily expensive public transit. DeKalb legislators of the time favored it, though, because it ensured that the train system would reach DeKalb rather than stymieing in the city of Atlanta only. More than that, though, the votes were referendums on race. The 5 counties were originally very rural, but white flight increased their populations as black people moved into the city during the Civil Rights era. Several black neighborhoods were displaced, and the people who fled have now encountered transportation problems because they live far out from the city where the public transport doesn't reach. And, of course, increasing fixation on automobiles didn't solve the problem. In fact, automobiles became so ubiquitous that the only people not using them were those too poor to use them, primarily black people, leading to the racist acronym Moving Africans Rapidly Through Atlanta. Where do we go from here?
Now, the land is largely too expensive to expand out onto, so people in far corners of the metro area drive to stations and then ride into the city. Otherwise, they've accomplished their goals of separation from black people. It's just separation in congested, unmoving vehicles on the highways. And that brings us to our current situation. A lack of public transportation poses economic and logistical infrastructure challenges, has decreased interest in corporate investments in the city, and propagates racial inequities.
Without public transit, many citizens are unable to get to a place of work and have thus been unable to properly hold a job. This means that unemployment rates are significantly higher than they could be with access to public transit. Furthermore, a lack of public transit has led to something known as social isolation, where people without means of transport find themselves home alone or only going to things a short distance away from them. This especially becomes a problem with the sick or elderly, or at least those who cannot walk to events and places near them. This increase in social isolation has then led to an increase in early mortality, depression, and even dementia. Of course, one may ponder why this problem could not be solved with owning a bike or living near a capable family. With this, the reality must be faced that sometimes these things are simply not an option. There are many people without the ability to move closer to their families, and worse yet, many without families to move closer to. As for an options like a bike, this still does not help the sick or elderly. Plus, if someone cannot afford to eat their next meal, how will they afford a method of transit like a bike? The lack of MARTA's expansion into the outlying Atlanta neighborhoods has effects on education as well, much for the same reason as before. Schools are not always accessible within walking distance, especially in rural areas. Students are not always able to reach these schools if their family cannot afford transportation. Of course, school buses are useful in that regard, but they sometimes don't go to some students' houses. A transportation system such as MARTA would help with this. Overall, the lack of an expansion of MARTA into the outlying regions of Atlanta remains a severe problem, and thus, we must propose a solution to this.
Atlanta's largest public transit system is really struggling to expand. So what was meant to be a $2.7 billion budget to expand MARTA, it just got slashed. MARTA says it doesn't have enough money to fund all 17 proposed projects, so it's knocking that down to 7. Here's why. MARTA CEO says inflation going up and ridership going down. Some people we spoke to reinforced that statement.
Where I live, it just doesn't go out that far. I mean, it's really got kind of a limited reach to the airport and back, and I live out in the Highlands, and so it doesn't really get me where I need to go.
It's nowhere near. I mean, to get to it, I'd almost be to work.
Riders and non-riders alike all told us they hope those 7 projects prioritize expanding routes. We are expecting to learn more about those final projects sometime in March.
One place where MARTA lacks significant infrastructure is in the northern suburbs. Despite rapid population growth in recent years, many of these suburbs remain poorly connected to the city. Northern rail stations are only accessible by car, making them impractical and underutilized. Many suburbanites have long opposed rail investments as they provide direct connections to the more racially diverse city center. The solution to this problem is Bus Rapid Transit, or BRT, which is cheaper and more flexible than rail. BRT is different from conventional bus services because it functions more like a train, including dedicated lanes, traffic light priority, and proper stations. These solutions address flaws in conventional bus services, where routes often have confusing schedules and buses are constantly held up by traffic. MARTA has already begun expanding BRT to its suburbs, including Campbellton, Summerhill, and South Lake. The MARTA 2040 project outlines several other locations where bus rapid transit can be implemented. Plans to build more BRT are also underway on the Georgia 400 corridor, which would help connect suburbs like Alpharetta, Johns Creek, and Roswell to MARTA's existing infrastructure. Another planned BRT route connects Emory University and the CDC to the Decatur Rail Station along the Clifton corridor. Implementation of BRT gives poorly connected suburbs access to the benefits of public transit, all at a lower cost than expanding rail networks. The best way to support transit is to ride it. Increased ridership demonstrates to city officials that public transit is worth the investment. Further transit funding is essential for projects like BRT. You can further support expansion of transit by voting for transit supportive policies on your ballot and reaching out to your area's lawmakers. With expansion, transit can give critical infrastructure to the suburban communities that need it most.